quick programming note before we jump in, and this will sound familiar if you've listened to episode 1, which, while not absolutely required, I really would encourage you to do because these discussions really do build on each other. But either way, just want to note at the top that this discussion was recorded in December 2019, before coronavirus, before George Floyd, before a whole host of things that really characterize our present moment. So if you notice moments where timely examples are conspicuously absent, that's why. But we think that the topics we touch on are more relevant than ever, and appreciate you taking the time to listen along. So with that in mind, on to the show. Welcome to episode 2 of the series, Parenting in a New Context, Strategies for Practitioners Supporting Refugee and Immigrant Caregivers. It's a podcast series made for and by mental health practitioners about serving refugee and immigrant families. And once again, it's a collaboration between the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital, the Center for Resilient Families at the University of Minnesota, and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I'm your host, Trevor Born, with the Center for Resilient Families, and in this episode, I'm really pleased to be joined by 2 team members from the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center, Osob Issa, a clinical social worker and program coordinator, and Emma Cardelli, a research associate and clinical psychologist. And they're here to talk about the cultural dynamics that can influence parenting among refugee and immigrant caregivers. Now, if you're just tuning in, you may want to go back and listen to episode 1, which is a conversation with our colleagues Luna Mulder and Jeff Winter about some of the foundational concepts we'll be building on today. Osob and Emma, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's wonderful being here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so 2 terms that come up a lot in your work are cultural values and cultural expectations. So before we get into the conversation, could you briefly explain what you mean by those 2 terms?
Sure, Trevor. Cultural values are the core principles and ideals upon which an entire community exists. These values are often not obvious to outsiders. In contrast, for group members themselves, these cultural values usually dictate the way they move through the world and are infused into everything they do.
Yeah, in my Somali culture, religious education is valued and considered to be critical for children's healthy development. And I believe sometimes it is a protective factor.
Absolutely. With regard to cultural expectations, a person's cultural expectations typically reflect commonly held standards of what is acceptable or unacceptable, important or unimportant, right or wrong within a community or society. There can be more of a value judgment attached to cultural expectations.
Yeah, and again, I think in my Somali culture, especially now, those of us who are here in the United States, girls are not allowed to have sleepovers, and that's driven by the need to protect the young women. And I think back home, there was not such a thing as a sleepover. It's like you go to your uncle's house or you go to your friend's house and the whole community know each other. It was fine.
So when we have different norms like this or practices or values, how does that shape the nature or character of parenting across different cultures?
So, as I see it, cultural values, expectations, and practices are typically passed down from one generation to the next and reflect historical ways of being. From a parenting perspective, the way we were parented tends to impact how we then subsequently parent our children. They guide routines and rituals at home, inform communication style between parent and child, shape disciplinary practices, all that stuff.
Absolutely. And in my Somali culture, parents typically communicate to young girls that one of their primary responsibilities is to care for the household chores, such as cleaning, cooking, and really kind of being the young mother to everyone. If a young Somali girl is not fulfilling this responsibility, then there tend to be a disappointment on the part of the mother, as well as sort of the larger community, maybe, because there's an assumption that made that either the daughter has become too westernized or the mother is not teaching these skills to her daughter.
Now, we're thinking specifically about families with a refugee or immigration experience. So how does this act of migration impact these values and these expectations?
Yeah, when you are in a country that is different than yours, there is a feeling that you are almost alone in having to reinforce cultural values and expectations in your children, particularly if you have children. Mm-hmm. Whereas when they are living in their native country, the entire community is really supporting with each other on this, instilling these values in their kids. And here in America, parents are really alone, and this adds additional stress.
Absolutely. Yeah, their values might not be held by the collective and their resettlement community in the same way. And what I mean by that is that the people around them, their neighborhood or community at large, might hold cultural values with regard to parenting that differ greatly from their own. Consequently, there can be this loss of support system around certain parenting values, norms, and practices secondary to migration, which is, I think, Osob, why you were saying they can be really alone and isolated.
Yeah. And there's another piece. Kids growing up in a new culture might push back the cultural values because they are comparing their new culture to sort of they're making comparison of like their parents' culture and the culture that they are growing up. So they're challenging the cultural values that are important to the family in a way that wouldn't if they were back home.
And yeah, we touched on this idea of acculturation and acculturative stress briefly in episode 1, basically how this process of joining a different culture can create tension between parents and children. I know you've done a lot of work on this. Can you explain that concept a little more and some of the work you've done to address it?
Sure, I'll give it a try. Osob, feel free to chime in. So refugee and immigrant children tend to acculturate to American norms and practices faster than their parents, in part because they spend so much of their week within the American school system, where they're constantly exposed to commonly held American values, norms, and practices. Since the parents are not connected to the school system to the same extent as their kids, they just don't have access to this content to nearly the same degree. This can cause parents to feel ineffective, disempowered, and less knowledgeable as their children learn more and more about American culture and norms, in addition to just feeling more distant or disconnected from their children. Furthermore, in response to their children's just rapid rate of acculturation, and I think in reaction to all the changes that families are asked to make secondary to resettling in a new country, refugee parents can hold fairly tightly to cultural values and norms congruent with how they themselves were raised. And this dynamic can create a tension between the child who really wants to fit in and belong and the parent who, in many ways, did everything they could do to get their child to a safe place where elements of that child's culture of origin can actually still be a core element of the child's identity. Some families struggle with conflict, a lack of communication, or secret keeping as a result. And these families can often benefit from mental health or psychosocial support services to help parents and children navigate this acculturative tension and align around a common goal.
Absolutely. And I think just to add, I think that because the structure of the way that they live right now is so different, that there is just a less family time in here. Where back home, you have no choice. Like there was families were always together. And it was seen as really as a protective factor. It was a good thing. And here, just the reality of kids being in school all day or people working, there's just less chance to be together. And then that alone creates conflict because they're like, okay, how do we now communicate?
Absolutely, yeah. So in our clinical work at the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center, we've developed a treatment model called Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees, or TSTR, a multi-tiered, empirically supported behavioral health intervention that includes family work in order to address both issues of safety and acculturative stress within the family system. The family sessions are focused on teaching parenting skills in a culturally responsive manner, facilitating open communication, and increasing empathy and perspective taking across the entire family system. As consultants in the model, Osob and I are often teaching clinicians and cultural brokers strategies for helping both the parent and child better understand the stresses and demands on one another, in addition to better understanding the ways in which they signal their love and care, the ways in which they speak their own love languages that sometimes get lost as a result of acculturation.
Yes, it is all about holding both perspectives without judging anyone and finding a balance. As a practitioners in the West, a lot of models, it's really center the individual. I think and parents might be coming from a culture, especially refugee parents might be coming from a culture where really not only one child matters, but everyone matters. Just because it's really their collectivism culture where like if you're going to treat one child, just treat the whole family. Yeah.
Now, I know that there's also this dynamic where, for instance, an American-born provider might have their own implicit biases about what are and are not acceptable parenting practice. Can you speak to that and sort of the tension that can cause?
Sure. So I think some of the American-born providers we work with carry their own implicit biases around what is and is not acceptable parenting practices, which makes perfect sense. Again, as we were talking about before, you parent in the way in which you were parented, or you think what is right oftentimes reflects your own kind of cultural values, right? So these providers can have a hard time understanding from a refugee parent's perspective why the parent doesn't want the child going out at a certain time or want their child involved in certain activities or wearing certain clothes. As a result, when there's a significant acculturation gap between the parent and child, the provider, without any malintent, can sometimes overly identify with the perspective of the child, wanting to connect with American culture and not give enough space to the parent's perspective, which is a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
So for a provider that's working with these families that are dealing with this challenge of family acculturation, what are some concrete things they can do to mitigate that stress?
I think simply just acknowledge that being a parent is difficult job. It's not an easy job. And particularly raising kids in a new country. Support them. Don't come across as judgmental, but really sympathetic and saying, if you're not a parent, just say, I'm not a parent. I have no idea what that role is like, but how can I be supportive? And also empower their voice. I think often parents, because of lack of language or lack of just not being familiar with this culture, I think sometimes their power and kind of their knowledge that they bring gets lost. And I think they're often made feel like that they don't know enough or they are less capable of raising their kids when in fact they are.
I couldn't agree more. And I also do think that psychoeducation with parents is another important intervention strategy. It can be important to help a refugee parent understand common American norms and practices that a child is constantly being exposed to at school, again, because they don't have the same access. On the flip side, you can also do work on helping to educate the child, particularly if the child is an adolescent or older, on where the parent is coming from. A lot of refugee children might have been born in refugee camps and therefore not have as much access to the parents' culture of origin. They weren't exposed in the same way. Their life, in another country was really confined to a refugee camp, which was not even in the country in which a parent was born. So I think that's another important piece.
Absolutely. Just to add that, I think that, yes, I absolutely agree that education is powerful. And I think that often because kids know, they're smart, that once they're here, they have so much power. And so I think practitioners often try to advocate for the kids' wants and needs, when I think, in fact, that they could be this middle place of advocating for both and sort of like, okay, how can they listen to each other?
Exactly.
And be at the center of that.
Oh, so a provider, you can sort of be a liaison, essentially, between these different perspectives.
Absolutely. And yes, within the TSTR model, the clinician and cultural broker are often facilitating family meetings so that there can be open communication and curiosity around both perspectives instead of judgment. You're liaisoning those different perspectives. In some cases, though, there may be so much tension when you're first starting off the clinical work that you have to work separately with the child and parents so that you can prepare both to be able to hear and hold the other's perspective with empathy and curiosity.
Absolutely, yeah. And really, not only, I would say like the other message that cultural brokers and clinicians sometimes send, at least the ones when we provide consultation, is this modeling.
Yes, in terms of them being from different cultures themselves.
Exactly, yes. And I think the cultural broker is sort of saying, like, especially if they spend most of their lives here, that, look, I am also someone that carries multicultural or more than one culture and sort of facilitating, like, has not lost their culture. I think sometimes parents think that the longer you're in America, the sooner you will lose your culture.
Yes.
But that's really not true.
Yes.
Well, thanks so much, Osob and Emma, for your time today. We're going to take this understanding of the way that culture influences parenting and really build on it in episode 3, which is going to look at the ways that the experience of trauma impacts parenting and the particular impact of trauma on refugee and immigrant families. So be sure to tune into that and check out the show notes for links to learn more about what we've discussed today. Thank you for listening, and thank you again for joining me today.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, fabulous.